Hi everybody. Today we're going to be talking about something that is a really important topic. They all are, but particularly important. May stir up some stress within you. I encourage you to, as I'll mention in a few minutes, reach out to the RDVIC, which is the Rape and Domestic Violence Information Center. If you are triggered in any way by this, in FamCommCh9 we never know what will trigger people to react negatively, but this is certainly one that could. So we're going to be talking about conflict, violence, and abuse in families. So first and foremost, I want to talk about the importance of the issue. Jumping to West Virginia stats, we know that as a state, we're not doing fairly well in this realm. We have high amounts of abuse, and the RDVIC, they always provide some really great up-to-date information. They collect that data as well and contribute to it. But in West Virginia, we have a lot of domestic violence, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and family is a particularly powerful realm to talk about these things. So I want to point out to you that abuse affects families of all races, people of all sexes, people of sexual orientations, people of all ages, and of incomes. So while we might look at something like income and see that low socioeconomic status, individuals who take a low income and don't have as much education, that they're going to be more likely than higher income levels to be convicted of violent crimes against their family. That does not mean that they experience it at higher rates or the incredibly higher rates. And it also doesn't mean that higher income levels don't experience abuse. We know that they do. Different forms of abuse, but all different amounts of the different types of abuse. But we're seeing it across the board. Also, while many of you are actually in the age bracket, 16 to 25, you are the most likely to experience physical abuse in a romantic relationship or in a family relationship. That is not to say that it can't happen to young children, middle-aged, and even older adults, but you are at a slightly higher propensity to experience this. So all races, we know that this affects races fairly equivalently. And while we'll talk about how women are more often reporters, and we feel confident in saying that in terms of the sexual and physical abuse, they are more often perpetrated against. We know that men are often the victims of abuse, as are boys. And in terms of sexual orientation, we know that those who are victimized and who are gay or lesbian are probably facing an even greater amount of social desirability bias when they're reporting what they experience in their relationships, and they are probably also less likely to report. Reporting is incredibly underreported, but it may be even more so for marginalized groups because they know that they are already subject to ridicule in their community, as a community, so that's likely to come forward. So we're not doing very well as a state either. We rank very high in terms of the number of problems in terms of all the things we'll talk about today in terms of abuse. It's the most frequent crime to which the police officers respond, and that's true across America, and most perpetrators are repeat offenders. So while it's an abundant crime, we also see that someone who does it once does it again and again and again, which gives you an idea of its scope. It's fewer people committing these crimes than just every crime is committed by a different person. And of course, many of these crimes are unreported. Puppies. So let's talk about partner/spousal abuse. There's a link, but it's not absolute, between children of abuse, people who have experienced their parents abuse each other and who have been abused themselves, directly abused themselves, and becoming an abuser or in a relationship with an abuser as an adult. So that's one cycle. Experience it as a child, live it as an adult. It's not an absolute, it can be broken. One cycle of abuse. This just gives you data from a 95-96 study. I know that's older, but look how complete it is. Look at all the people who provided information for this. And we found that nearly 25% of women, 7.6% of men were raped or physically assaulted. They had experienced abuse by someone that they saw as familial. How do these relationships begin? This is a bit of a trick question. that begin just like all other relationships. So when you think about your interpersonal classes and the ways that remember the rising, that staircase with Knapp and Duck's model, the way that relationships come together, it's the same for abusive and non-abusive relationships because they don't start off abusive. They don't start that way. They look the same. They have the same first date scripts. They have the same types of patterns that you would see in other relationships. However, over time, we do see some warning signs. These warning signs could come early, fairly early, like a few dates in, you might see some start to emerge. Some after a formal commitment. Some could be years down the road before these start to emerge. Frequent contact, kind of checking in. I'm talking serious checking in. Last unit we talked a little bit about affection and how the way that with affection it starts off really strong and it coincides with lust and that intense emotion. You're always thinking it's like obsessive compulsive disorder. So that's going to happen. But most of us refrain from always contacting that person. Frequent contact can be a sign of something to come. Always checking in, getting upset if they don't know where the other person is. Jealous of other relationships, not just romantic, could be a parent that they're jealous of, that partner's parent, that partner's friend, a coworker, a child. Doesn't have to be romantic. Overly protective. So when someone is so protective of their partner, but particularly regarding other people. So not like you got to wear your seatbelt or let's make sure that we get all the cars fixed and up to speed and let's make sure that, not those ways. Protective in terms of the relationships around that person. Blaming past relationships on others. It's a big old warning sign if someone that you're in a relationship with is always saying it was other people's fault. They're not taking ownership. They're not accountable. Warning. Losing temper quickly. Bragging about the mistreatment of others. I knew a woman who once told a story of when she had cheated on her partner, and then after she told him, he cried and she laughed at him. And as she told this story, she laughed to us about it. She was proud of herself. That is an enormous warning sign to brag about how you've harmed another person. So even though I just used an example of a woman, you can see where a lot of these are a part of our masculine, what we were talking about before in terms of masculinity and gender norms. Certainly, I don't think that we tell men be overly protective. But in relationships, particularly regarding romance, being protective, showing that interest, being passionate. These are things that are condoned. I would argue, and other scholars argue, more for men than for women. And so I certainly I'm not in the business of judging people. I do get a little judgy about behaviors, and these are behaviors that I start to get judgy about. And I also judge society's messages that it's a good thing to be blaming others for things. It's a good thing to say, I didn't do anything wrong. No, it's not. Be accountable. And society definitely gives those messages. So these warning signs that we see in a partner, keep in mind that the partner isn't the only factor involved. And you should gather that by now in FamCommCh9. So let's talk about Lenore Walker's cycle of abuse. So this is a very famous book of hers where she details a common, though not all the time, a common trend for abusive relationships. So I'm going to use my little pointer here. So when we're talking about ultimately abuse, let's just use an example of physically hitting someone. Okay, that's the abusive act. That's what we're going to be talking about in a minute. So let's start down here with tensions. You're in a relationship, it started off great, and now some of these warning signs have emerged. Tense. It's a tense situation. So talking about that past partner and the betrayal and wasn't that funny. But also being edgier, more easily distracted and a little more than grumpy, sharp with one's tone. It's a tense situation. Let's say this someone is me. Let's say I'm doing these negative things and you feel tense around me. Well, it's tense, it gets tenser and tenser until something happens. Maybe you tell me that you think that my friend is cute and that makes me upset. Maybe you don't come home from work on time, or my dinner wasn't ready. So this is an event that comes before my abuse toward you, and because it comes right before, it's called the triggering event. That happens, and then I hit. And the abuse, that's just a hit. It could go on longer. So I hit you. Afterward, I am very remorseful. I am so sorry. I will never do it again. That wasn't me. I can't believe that happened. Please forgive me. And you agree, I'm sure, that it doesn't happen, it shouldn't happen, and you forgive me. Say, I'll give you another chance. So then things go on in this block down here, which we call the honeymoon phase. It's all, maybe I get you flowers, maybe we just spend a lot of time together. We return almost to how we behaved when we first had our relationship, really affectionate, really caring. But after a while, I go back to these negative behaviors, and you start to get tense around me again. Tensions build. Many people talk about walking on eggshells. You're going to maneuver your behaviors so that you don't set me off, because the setting off is this triggering event. Now, last time I gave examples of things that you might do right before, but I want you to keep in mind that the triggering event may have nothing to do with you. It may totally have to do with me. Triggering event could be that I had a bad day at work. Triggering event may be that I drank. Triggering event may be that I'm feeling upset about something that happened with my brother. Trigger event occurs, and I'm abusive toward you, and the abuse might be hitting. It might be long cycles of other behaviors. It might go on and on and on, but then I'm going to come back to the remorse, and we're going to walk through this again. So as we go around and around, Lenore Walker describes how this remorse and forgiveness and the honeymoon stage that follows, they get shorter and shorter. So this circle starts to close in a bit. It gets shorter and shorter until abuse goes right to more tension. And the triggering event is just about anything until abuse occurs. And even though that triggering event could be really just about anything, we find that targets of abuse who get through it, they really have a good sense of reading the tensions and trying to determine when is that person closest to the propensity to being triggered. Okay. Aw, they didn't even know each other. Just met off the boat. You got off the boat, smooches. Partner abuse takes many forms: physical, emotional, verbal, and sexual. The emotional verbal is asterisk because we know that people who experience all three talk about emotional and verbal being the absolute worst, the most damaging to them. Now, of course, part of this has to do with the fact that physical pain, not only we forget, I've had 3 babies, I forget much of that pain, I really do. I know that it hurt, but I don't remember exactly how it felt. But I'm sure you're the same. I can remember the awful things that people have said. I know the emotional stuff. It stays with me. Those words, they scar. And plus, physical scars, society accepts and says, oh, yep, you got hit, that's awful. But emotional abuse, it hurts so much, but people might say things like, well, but did he hit you yet? And really minimizes that emotional verbal abuse that's so painful. And physical and sexual, of course, have an emotional component. They have a communicative component. All of these are based on power and control. Effects to the victim: panic attacks, brain tumors, gastrointestinal symptoms, and also, although I just described how targets are really good at reading their abuser, that standpoint theory, we know that people who have less power need to know more about those with power for their own survival. So this nonverbal decoding is about other people. When you've been spending so much time learning how to read your abuser, you actually become worse at decoding other people's behaviors. Your barometer's off. Here's the power and control wheel. Take a moment. Maybe you've seen this before. This is something that we use a lot when we're working with people who are in or coming out of abusive relationships. So if you look at the different chunks on here, the different pie pieces, and when I'm done gabbing, you might want to pause it for a minute and look at it some more. What's really important is you must think of these, as we talked about, think about all this as transactional and occurring within the context of abusive relationships. So when we look at this circle, the outside of the circle is it says physical and sexual violence, but it's really the threat of physical and sexual violence. Because While you may have found yourself in relationships or even done some of these behaviors yourself that you see on these different pie pieces or parts of the wheel, I want you to think about what that looks like when the person enacting those behaviors is explicitly or implicitly communicating that they could hurt you. So let me pick just one of them. If you look at using intimidation, making her afraid, looks, scoffs, gestures, smashing things, destroying property, abusing pets, displaying weapons. Now let's look at that, displaying weapons. Well, we've been talking about abuse, so we can probably think what that might look like in an abusive relationship. I may be the abusive party. You come home late from work because you're working hard at your job. You're supporting our family. You told me you were going to come home from late for work, but I wanted to see you. So when you walk in the door, I go over to my guns and I stand there and I say, well, what makes you think that you can come in so late? And as you're trying to describe it, I, right by the gun rack, say something about my guns or just look at the guns and say, that's not how we do things around here. You really upset me. And the fact that I'm right by my guns makes it more intimidating. Okay? If you have guns in your home that you display, it doesn't mean that you're an abuser. Just like if you limit, well, a lot of these are in themselves abusive, but if you don't let your partner know about some family income that you have, maybe you're saving it for a trip to Disney or something exciting like that, that doesn't make you an abuser. If you're saving money and you're keeping it secret and you're doing that because you want to keep her with you, you want to isolate her, then that is abusive. Okay? And we know that it's working, and we know this power and control is at hand because if you look at these behaviors in and of themselves, she'd probably just walk away from you, right? But she's afraid to go because you're intimidating her. Okay? So power and control wheel. So you can look at those in your own time. I won't go through and read every little one and give you lots of examples, but I could tell you for days different examples. To differentiate between conflict and abuse, that's that outer circle of the wheel. So if you're wondering, am I in an abusive relationship or not, I want you to think about that. I want you to think about, are you afraid? Are you afraid of what will happen next? Is this person, even though you're trying to predict their behavior, are they unpredictable? Causes. Some calm explanations are, they're not mentioned much in your text, but this frustration aggression hypothesis, it just says that the abuser's goals are blocked, so they lash out. Catalyst hypothesis, they're coerced from others to lash out. So that trigger event we talked about is more of an active strategy on the part of the target. Skills deficiency, none of these receive great support, but skills deficiency receives the most of the three. It's the most logical, is that we don't have the skills and we resort to violence. So as an abuser, I don't have the skills necessary, like we talked about all of FamCommCh9 class. I haven't learned those things. My family didn't teach me how to behave in constructive pro-social ways. So when I'm faced with a difficult situation, I feel a lot of stress from it, I resort to violence. Now what this implies is that someone who's abusive is deficient. I agree that they are deficient in pro-social skills, but they might know the skills, and simply decide that doing these behaviors are going to get them what they want. I would argue, after working in shelters in 3 different states and talking to many abusers and targets of abuse, that people can be very skilled at being abusive, just like people can be very skilled at committing other types of crimes. And the more skilled they are, the longer they do it without suffering consequences from it. So they could be really smart. They could be stupid, just like anybody. And like any group, most of them are somewhere in the middle of those very large extremes. But I just want you to think carefully and be cautious when someone tries to paint a group with one broad brushstroke, saying things like, well, they're dumb, they don't know what to do. So that's not what those researchers said, but people will argue they're dumb, and so that's why they resort to those things. Well, they might be very strategic. They haven't lost their jobs, they haven't been arrested for this crime, they haven't done it to other people, they do it with the people at home who they're supposed to love and cherish. So they might be quite systematic and sophisticated in their thinking. It's just not pro-social. Social learning theory, I think, is the best explanation for why abuse continues. So media, society, and particularly home environments can encourage dominance as a way to go about getting what you want. So many of you raised smart questions about choice, habit, learning, and some pro-social examples, and how all of these are ways that we can learn more pro-social skills, more pro-social ways of communicating. And I encourage more of that in your discussion questions and answers. Why not just leave an abusive family? Well, you don't have the resources, you don't have the money, you don't have a place to go. Fear, are those fears justified? They sure are. So abusers may say, if you leave me, I will hurt you. And that may be just a threat that's thrown out there. But we do know that when people leave their abusers, they're at greater risk of being harmed. So, you know, if you think of someone who is abusive and using power and control, when the person that they're abusing leaves, they're not going to go, oh, psh, you got me. I tried to control you. You showed me. Now you're gone. I'm going to be mad. And I am going to use that power and control to try and hurt you. Now I'm going to be even more intent on hurting you. Love. People are complex. Relationships are complex. There could have been years of love, intense love, or slow and steady love amidst all of this. Societal, cultural, and family expectations that the couple stay together, that men do this and women do this, that what's considered inappropriate versus appropriate behavior. Not being believed, the guilt that people feel from leaving, that if they leave, then other people in the family could get hurt worse. If they leave, the abuser themselves could hurt himself or herself. Sex differences, we do know that there are more reports of male to female abuse that more frequently occurs. Also, the size, strength, and socialization has a lot to do with that. It's also underreported. All of it's underreported, but particularly we think that men are less likely to report than women based on other data that we have. But if we think about crimes and statistics, in many relationships, both are abusive. I keep it simple in my examples. There's an abusive person and there's a target, but oftentimes both people are abusive. Child abuse, how that abuse begins and develops. Frustrations with children is often the start. Parents don't know how to care for their kids. They don't have enough support, and so they resort to abusive behaviors as a disciplinary tool. I just want to point this out because it's really important in a family comm class. When I'm on Facebook, I see a lot of stuff like, I turned out all right. My parents hit me. Okay, got your point. Granted. But let's get some deeper understanding here, okay? There are no known positive effects of physical punishment. Spanking, slapping, hitting, and other physical forms of punishment empirically show no positive effects to children. I will say that there is evidence if something like, spanking is accompanied with very clear direction saying, if you enact this behavior, this will be the punishment of spanking. When it's done by a parent who is trustworthy and by a parent who is calm when they do the spanking, and if that parent after the spanking occurs say, that's the end of that, do you understand why? And then they have some loving gesture, then we can see that no negative things happen, okay? But a lot of times that's not how spanking and other forms of physical punishment are delivered. And so there is a risk that negative outcomes can ensue. Also, if we just step back for a minute, when we consider the power of modeling, if we as parents are telling children, you do something wrong, I want you to stop it, I want you to engage in a different behavior, I'll use physical force to get you to do it, they can then take that into their own relationships. Once I had a parent say, I can't believe that my kid hit somebody, I'm going to make sure that we don't have that again, he's getting a spanking when we go home. And I thought, if you want your child to not hit other people, maybe you shouldn't hit him to prove your point. So it's just something that we might think about, and there are so many other options of physical or aside from physical punishment, like timeouts, taking away privileges. There are a lot of age-appropriate things. Based on age, there are appropriate things that you can do for discipline. And I'm not saying that physical forms are always negative, but They very well can be. And usually when discipline is enacted, often in these ways, we see some very negative outcomes. Children's communication behavior, some warning signs of abuse: extremely aggressive or overly passive, compliant behavior, social withdrawal, or bullying. So we got some extremes here. And then also a sudden onset of criminal behavior. Anytime there's a sharp change in someone's behavior, that might be going on. Whoops. Child abuse takes many forms: physical, emotional, and sexual. Also, neglect is incredibly harmful. Watching parents abuse each other is equivalent to being directly abused, meaning if a parent abuses another parent and their child knows about it, that has the same harmful effects as that parent physically hurting their child. That's how harmful it is. It's so harmful that it in and of itself is child abuse to abuse another parent. Other relationships, sibling to sibling is a very common form of physical abuse, but we don't see the power and control issue so much. Young child to parent, they don't have the same power and control cycles, but that's something that happens particularly when the child has some sort of emotional problem or disability. Adult child to aging parent, this includes financial exploitation and neglect, but it could also be emotional sexual abuse. These discussion questions, these might be things that you think about and expand upon in your own discussion questions and answers, but I do want to point out number 3. Should abusive couples attend counseling, marriage counseling? No, they should not. Anytime at least one party is abusing the other party, marriage counseling is or couples counseling is a really bad idea. It's just another place for that person to enact power and control, and when those two people leave, the marriage counselor sits in his or her office, they're gone and can really, you talk about a triggering event. That office may be somewhat of a safe space, but not after they leave. It is not a good idea. It's best to separate them and work on the abusive behaviors and try and change those things. Okay? Conflict, perceived as disagreement about goals, rules, roles, cultures, and patterns of common. It manifests in our communication in diverse ways. So we talked about family patterns last time. I want you to keep in mind that in pluralistic, consensual, laissez-faire, and protective families, we see the trends you might expect. So those highly adjusted families are highly adjusted in conflict too. And they have good conflict resolution. The people who are the least adept at managing conflict are the laissez-faire. They've had no examples. And those that are in, sorry to clip back and forth, the protective families believe that conflict cannot happen. And so thinking conflict just cannot happen or never happen doesn't help you to deal with it. So common sources of conflict are standards, meeting and matching. We talked about those last time. Also intrusion and relations with your in-laws. Your children. Infertility is even a source of conflict for couples. The care for children and behavior problems. And this phenomenon of feeling caught. Feeling caught is when a child is literally feeling like I'm caught between this parent and this parent. This parent says bad things about this parent, and this parent says bad things about this parent, and I'm in the middle, and it's so hard. That is also a source of conflict and tension. The bright side, if handled effectively, conflict can help us resolve disagreements and the stress they create. And so here are some prescriptions. Ongoing collaboration, engaging, don't avoid, and complaining, let them know, but don't criticize. That's even true for money, which is a big old problem in families. And stay positive in your communication and how you attribute that other person's behaviors. How are we going to learn this? From our family. So do good and spread that good in your families. It's a hard lecture to do, and it's a hard lecture to listen to. Thank you so much for sitting through it. I'll have the review sheet up for you for this so that you can guide and see the little bit that I want you to know from the chapter. And then I also encourage you to do a discussion question and answer on this or on the next unit. Thank you so much.